Okay, I wanted to say a little bit about the subject matter of week 3, unit 3, which is the question of what is a religion. The first 2 units weren't really philosophical. As I think I said in the introduction, the idea of the first 2 units is to learn a bit about at least 3 religions that you might be unfamiliar with, unless you're a student of religions or something. Mainly for the purpose of discussing questions like the one that we're interested in Unit 3. But also because I think it is important to know a bit about the great world religions. I think people tend to be a little bit ignorant in general. This isn't universally true, but in general tend to be a little bit ignorant of religions that they don't follow. And it's good to find out that there's a lot in common between the great religions. One thing, for example, you discover when reading about the religions is there's kind of parallels. Each of the religions seems to have a schism at some point, like for example in Islam between Sunni and Shia, or in Buddhism between Mahayana and Theravada. Christianity, there's the split between Catholic and Protestant, and also of course Orthodox. With Hindu it's less so, but Hinduism is so diverse anyway that there's various camps you can follow, Vishnu or Shiva, or you can regard them as all facets of the same thing. So there's lots of splits in Hinduism. But what's also interesting, so there's a lot in common between them. And another parallel is each of them seems to have like a bureaucracy element, a church element, if you like, and a mystical element. So in Hinduism, for example, you have the Brahmin class of what you might call priests, who have to memorize the Veda and are very learned, and they're members of the highest caste. But then you can also be an important religious figure by being a guru. And gurus, instead of having to learn the Veda and sort of come up through the ranks and be born into the right caste, can speak directly from one of the gods and be a mouthpiece for one of the gods without having to go through the bureaucratic red tape or be born into the right caste. So it's a route for non-traditional Hindu figures to play a role in play an important religious role. And we saw, for example, if you read the introduction to Hinduism, a lot of gurus are female, and this enables women to have an important role that they are otherwise denied in Hinduism, which tends to be a little bit sexist. There's parallels in Christianity. For example, one famous figure is Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was, of course, a woman who heard God commanding her to lead the French against the British, and she became not only a martyr, but she was a general, which was unheard of for a woman, and not just a woman, but a peasant, a very lower class figure. So she, through a direct mystical sort of portal to God, achieved a high religious status that otherwise would have been denied her, because she could never have been, of course, a priest, which is the usual route to religious authority. So there's that other divide that we see between traditional church structure and hierarchy, and then the sort of mystical element. In Islam, the mystical element is Sufism, and you can read about that as well. So in contrast with imams who play the sort of bureaucratic role, Sufi mystics stress that you and your God can have a direct contact. So there's all these interesting parallels amongst the great religions, but of course there's also important differences. And I think Islam and Christianity have a lot in common, and perhaps Hinduism and Buddhism have a fair amount in common, because Buddhism sort of grew out of Hinduism and has a lot of the same theory of the world. So for example, there's the cycle of birth and rebirth that you see in Hinduism is also an element of Buddhism, and the idea of karma and dharma, they're also carried over. Although it's interesting to note that while Hindus believe in a soul, the Buddha very much stressed that there is no such thing as a soul. So it's kind of a puzzle what gets reborn in Buddhism, how you get reborn. So both Hinduism and Buddhism, they don't have this idea that the world had to be created. The world has already existed. Has always existed. And they also don't have this idea that, there's this earthly life and then there's heaven or hell. No, you stay on this earthly cycle and get born and reborn and reborn and reborn. Except, of course, the Buddhists put the twist that actually the goal of Buddhism is to escape this cycle of birth and rebirth by achieving nirvana. So there's a lot of elements, similar overlap between Buddhism and Islam, and there's this overlap between Buddhism and Hinduism, and then there's this overlap between Islam and Christianity. Islam recognizes most of the biblical figures, and of course there's that story of when Muhammad returns to the temple in Mecca and destroys all of the religious figures in there except for Mary and Joseph. Mary and Joseph he doesn't destroy because they are figures in the tradition that Islam grows out of. So the Christian God and Allah in Islam are of course the same God. However, there are similarities, but there's also differences. And perhaps most glaring for Buddhism is this, that it doesn't seem to have a God. Hinduism has many gods, and actually, according to Shankara, one of the Vedantins, which means interpreter of the Veda, all of the gods are aspects of one, and in fact we are all aspects of this one reality. So everything is one. And really, to divide the Hindu pantheon into separate individual figures is to misunderstand the true nature of reality. So he's, according to Shankara, Hinduism correctly understood is not polytheistic, meaning, of course, polytheistic means many gods, and that's how Hinduism is usually seen, but he gives a sort of monotheistic interpretation. Now, the other two famous Vedantins don't necessarily agree, but certainly that's one element of Hinduism. So certainly there are Hindus who believe that there is one God. However, Buddhists, and certainly classic Theravada Buddhists, do not believe in a God. Certainly not a creator God. They do believe in gods, but they're not gods as we would normally understand them, because each of us can become a god by moving up the scale of rebirth. So you start low on the lowest rung, and then you become animals, and so on, and then you become humans, and if your karma keeps promoting you, you become a god, and that means you can live for a very, very, very long time. And actually, becoming a god is a bit of a barrier to nirvana, according to the Buddha, because you can get too comfortable as a god and forget that the point is to escape this cycle this wheel of birth and rebirth. So, we think of these things, these four, for example, as great world religions. Not the only great world religions. There are others, of course. Judaism, there's Jainism, there's Sikhism. There are many, many, many religions. But perhaps the largest, and Hinduism, one of the oldest. That's the oldest of the four. But should we really think of them all as just instances of religions? We need to know what it is that classifies them as religions. What do they all have in common that marks them as different from other, say, ways of life? Because there's a lot of cultural elements. Certainly, for example, with Hinduism seems to have a lot of elements of just culture. Hinduism has all of these social divisions. It tells you essentially how you should live your life. So how is that different from just the customs of a society? I mean, social customs do that. They tell you what the proper roles are for men and women, what the proper roles are for teachers, how you should live your life, what it is appropriate to do. They give you manners and ethical rules. These are all cultural standards, but we don't necessarily think of them as religious. So, for example, there's an American way of life. You might say that, mom, apple pie, and baseball. And it tells you what it is to live an admirable life. But we don't think of that as part of religion. We think that you can share an American way of life without sharing a religion. In fact, that's one of the founding principles of America, that there's this separation between religion and this sort of cultural essence of being American. Whereas for Hinduism, it's all, the religion and the culture are intimately wrapped up, and it's not even clear where one begins and one ends. In fact, that's why some members of the untouchable class, recognizing that they've been dealt a poor hand by their level of birth and by what Hinduism says, have recommended rejecting Hinduism, because after all, if your religion tells you that you're on the lowest rung and that you are destined to a life of the shittiest job, well, what's the incentive to continue to adhere to that religion? Why not become a Buddhist, or why not become a Christian, or something like that? A religion which does not tell you that you have to live this low-level life. It allows you more options. And that was one of the movements of the untouchables, or Dalits, in the 20th century, that they recommended mass conversion. So we need to know what exactly makes something a religion. Now, two philosophical tools can help us with approaching this question. One of them is mentioned in the chapter 1 of the Buddhism book, and that is the 7 dimensions suggested by Ninian Smart, who is a 20th century philosopher. Now, that's just a suggestion. That's one guy's opinion. And in philosophy, I think people, if you're not familiar with philosophy or you're used to other disciplines, you think, well, we're just learning the facts. This guy says that there are 7 dimensions to religion, and I guess there are 7 dimensions to religion. But in philosophy, one of the things that distinguishes it is that everything is always open to being questioned and challenged. And Ninian Smart's 7 dimensions are no different from any other. So the other tool that you need to have to address this issue of what is a religion is the tools of criticism. And here is one distinction that I think that I always teach in all my philosophy classes that is helpful for this purpose, the purpose of criticizing any theory that is presented to you. And not necessarily, people tend to think criticism is just negative and that it's just destructive and not useful. That's not what I mean by criticism. There is such thing as constructive criticism, and constructive criticism can actually lead you to strengthen your belief in a certain view. But it's a way of putting a view to the test. Unless you have put a point of view to some kind of criticism, you haven't really thought about it, and you're just accepting it as as if you were being brainwashed. You haven't really sort of earned the right to believe it, as a philosopher might say. Okay, so here's the philosophical distinction that is useful for this purpose and for all kinds of purposes in philosophy. It's the distinction between necessary and sufficient. And these are kind of conditions that one thing can be for another. When we say that something, let's call it A, is sufficient for something else, let's call it B, what that means, if A is sufficient for B, that means if you have A, or if A is true, then that guarantees that you have B, or that B must be true. So, for example, being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal, because if something is a dog, that guarantees that it is a mammal. Now notice, this doesn't mean gives you good reason to believe, or along with other things would give you this. It means by itself guarantees that the other is already true. So being a dog is not sufficient for something barking. Even though it seems to make it very likely, it doesn't absolutely guarantee it, because, some dogs don't bark, and some dogs have had their bark boxes removed because they were annoying little bastards, and their owners had them operated on. And there's actually breeds of barkless dogs that don't bark. So, when I say guarantee, I mean absolutely guarantee by itself. Alright, so that's sufficient. The other condition is necessary. So, if something, A, is necessary for something else, B, what this means is you can't have B without A. That's what necessary means. It means you've got to have it. So if A is necessary for B, you can't have B without A. So, for example, this is the example I always use, having gas in your tank is necessary for your car starting, assuming you don't have an electric car, which none of you do. So having gas in your tank is necessary for your car starting. Why? Because your car won't start without gas in your tank. Is having gas in your tank also sufficient? Because notice something can be both necessary and sufficient for something else, but only really if they're one and the same kind of thing. I'll give you an example of that in a second. But let's see. Is having gas in your tank sufficient for your car starting? No. Because having gas in your tank does not guarantee that your car will start. You can have a full tank of gas, but if you've left your headlights on overnight, your car isn't going to start. So, there's an example of necessary but not sufficient. Similarly, a dog will guarantee that you are a mammal. So being a dog is sufficient for being a mammal, but it's not necessary. Being a dog is not necessary for being a mammal because it's possible to be a mammal without being a dog. You can be a cat, you can be a human, and so on. Alright. Now, a good way to test a criterion for something is to see whether it is either necessary or sufficient. If it is neither, then maybe it's not definitive of, in this case, a religion. So, for example, imagine we said something can only be a religion if it involves belief in a creator God. So, what we're saying is, belief in a creator God is a necessary condition for something to be a religion. What that suggests is that something cannot be a religion unless it's a belief in a creator God. So, for example, the advantage of this is it would seem to distinguish religions from things like avid sports fandoms, because some people say, oh, he follows I can't imagine someone following the Tigers that strongly, but, well, I'm sure there are some people, sad, deluded people, who are fanatical fans of the Tigers. Can we say that following the Tigers is like a religion for them? Well, no, according to this standard, because this standard says something can only be a religion if it involves belief in a creator God. And the Tigers, following the Tigers does not involve belief in a creator God. Okay, so that's one suggestion, and it seems to have its advantages because it helps, because we don't think following the Tigers really is religious. We think people can get obsessed with it, but people can get obsessed with a lot of things like stamp collecting or Pokemon or stuff like that. But we don't think those really count as religion, because counting as religion is a big deal, particularly in America. You get tax breaks. All of these special rules apply to something as a religion. You have religious freedom. I mean, look at the Supreme Court case that just came down, the Hobby Lobby case. Just because the owners of Hobby Lobby have a religious objection to contraception, they don't have to provide contraception coverage to their employees. Now, they have to provide health coverage to their employees, but they get an exception when it comes to contraception. Now, this is a particularly controversial decision, as one of the dissenting justices pointed out. Wait a minute, does this mean that if they're Christian Scientists, and Christian Scientists don't believe in any medical treatment, they believe that you should just pray instead of going to the doctor, so Christian Scientist kids are always dying because they get stomach obstructions, and instead of going to the hospital for an operation, they just pray and the kid dies, and some Christian Scientists have been prosecuted for negligence, but I think they've been acquitted, or if they've been convicted, it's been appealed. But what if, the owners of a Hobby Lobby were Christian Scientists? They have a religious objection to any health coverage. Does this Hobby Lobby decision mean that, Christian Scientist business owners don't have to supply any health coverage? Well, that's a legal matter. But what this illustrates is that religion, whether or not something counts as a religion, is very important, because you get a special religious exemption. Whereas, suppose I'm a fanatical Tigers fan and I find out that some of my employees are Yankees supporters. Could I get an exemption for paying for their health coverage because I don't think that they should live because they're Yankees supporters? No court would support that. Well, why not? I'm fanatical about my support of the Tigers. Well, but it's not a religion. So it's usually thought that religion is something special. Then we need to be able to say what that is. Suppose the fanatical Yankee fan says, I'm going to take this to court. I think my support of the Yankees, it's essential to who I am, as, being a Christian or being a Muslim is to Christians and Muslims. This is the most important thing in my life. So why shouldn't it be given the same status as, your religion? We need to say what's special about a religion if we're going to answer that. And if you don't think that somebody's going to say that, then, you haven't been paying attention. I mean, people, what was that in the news just recently? A guy is suing ESPN because ESPN showed him asleep at a baseball game and he was humiliated, so he's suing them for damages. People sue about anything. So you need to be able to specify exact definitions. Alright, so that's the challenge, to define exactly what a religion is. Here's a suggestion. Now, notice I'm not saying that's a sufficient. Well, maybe you could. Maybe you could say, not only, let's suggest that here's my simple definition of a religion. It is both a necessary and a sufficient condition of being a religion that it involves belief in a creator God. All right, let's first of all test whether or not it's sufficient. Does involving the belief in a created God make something a religion? Does any belief set that involves the belief in a creator God make it a religion? Well, let's imagine a case where, I'll give you an example. I don't know if you're all familiar with the comedian Louis C.K. If not, check out YouTube. He's a funny guy. And actually, I think he's a bit of a philosopher. A lot of his musings are very philosophical. And he actually thinks a lot about religion, as well as masturbation. He seems to be particularly obsessed with that. But he's a funny guy. And he has a show on cable FX, I think. And he does lots of stand-up stuff. And very, very funny guy. Well, he once said, I believe that God exists. I just don't give a shit. Or something to that effect. Probably even more obscene than that. What does that say? I mean, so he's an example of someone who, say Louis C.K.ism involves belief in a creator God. But does it affect his behavior? No. No more than believing in, Jupiter or something, the planet. Yeah, sure, I believe in Jupiter. Does it affect my behavior? No, not at all. Do I care about Jupiter? No. Has no effect on what I'm going to do. So suppose it's true of Louis C.K. that he believes that there is a creator God, but doesn't care. Is he a religious person? If you say no, then what that suggests is that belief in a creator God is not in itself sufficient for whatever involves the belief, to be a religion. Alright, what about the separate question of whether or not it's necessary? In other words, do you have to have belief in a creator God, otherwise you're not a religion? Well, of course, one of the 4 religions that we've read about wouldn't count as a religion under this definition, which is Buddhism. Certainly Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism has no role in it for a creator God. In fact, Theravada Buddhism is pretty hard. It is one of the ones where I think you could make a good case that it isn't, certainly like the other religions. It's more like a sort of Confucianism or something like that, which is a guide for living, how to live well. Or Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, had a lot to say about how one should live. What is a good life? What should one do so that at the end of one's life one could say, I've lived a good life, I've lived the best life that I could. Aristotle has a lot to say about that, very sophisticated things. But very few people think that Aristotle was propounding a religion. So could we say that Buddhism isn't really a religion? It's been my experience that Buddhism is sort of the gateway drug to atheism. That a lot of people who convert from religions like Christianity or Islam to Buddhism are sort of stepping towards rejecting religion altogether. But that's not necessarily the case. And I'm sure there are people who are born into Buddhism who are very sincere about it. And certainly Buddhism involves belief in all kinds of things like spirits. If you watch, there's a great animated movie by there's an amazing Japanese animator called Miyazaki. Some of you might be very familiar with his work. Perhaps his most famous work in America, and that's the one I'm talking about, is called Spirited Away. Other movies of his that came out are Princess Mononoke, that was before Spirited Away, and an earlier one, My Neighbor Totoro. They're all wonderful. They're absolutely amazing. I recommend seeing anything that Miyazaki has produced. But Spirited Away in particular, to non-Buddhists, to people like me who are unfamiliar with Buddhism, is kind of eye-opening, because it imagines this sort of kind of mythical landscape where we see all these amazing spirits, and there's spirits of not just animals but of vegetables and all kinds of. It's kind of weird and wonderful, and it gives you an idea of sort of the Buddhist view of the world, the Buddhist view of the universe. And it's, it's not materialist. It's not like science, or so. In some sense, it certainly has a mystical and a spiritual element to it. But all the same, they don't believe that there is a God who created us. They have this story that we sort of evolved out of the universe sort of evolved in its own right, and isn't under the control of a particular person. Okay, so Buddhism wouldn't be a religion if belief in a creator God is a necessary feature of religions. Then Buddhism doesn't count. Now, what do we do with that? Well, there's two ways you can go. You could say, well, Buddhism doesn't count. But that seems like a pretty extreme view to take, and you would have to defend that view, given how so many people regard it as a religion, and certainly it seems to play the role in people's lives that religions do. And the other thing is, if it's not a religion, then it would be compatible with being Christian. Because if being Buddhist is not a religion, then you could be a Christian Buddhist. In the same way that, supporting the tigers is not a religion, so you can be a Christian person who supports the tigers. Presumably you think the tigers have done something very wrong and that God is punishing them so. But that doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right to say that you could be a Christian Buddhist, does it? In kind of the same way that it doesn't seem right to say that you could be, could you be a Christian atheist? Well, that's a different issue. Some people say you can. I used to work with a guy who trained as a priest and then discovered philosophy and rejected his Christian upbringing. And he used to say he was a Christian atheist because he thought that Christ was a wonderful person who said a lot of wonderful things and we should emulate the way he lived. It's just he wasn't the Son of God. He was just a guy who had some good ideas. Bit of a proto-hippie. Actually, Thomas Jefferson had a bit of the same view. If you look up Thomas Jefferson's Bible, Thomas Jefferson took a pair of scissors to his Bible and cut out all the bits that he thought weren't true, and that included all of the stuff about virgin birth and Jesus being the Son of God. So Thomas Jefferson had a bit of the same view too. He wasn't really he wasn't Christian in the same way that most Christians would regard themselves. He was what's called a deist. He didn't believe that God, that there was really a person out there watching over us. He did believe that there's something, but it wasn't necessarily a person that you could interact with. Benjamin Franklin had the same view. Okay, so the issue is, what is a religion? What must a religion have to count as a religion, and what mustn't it? Well, have a look at Ninian Smart's 7 Dimensions. That's part of the reading. I mean, there's mention of it in the first chapter of Buddhism, but it's focused specifically on whether or not Buddhism counts. But I've also given a web link to a summary of the 7 dimensions. And what I'd like you to do, if you write on this topic, or just to think about anyway, is to go through each of the dimensions and do the same kind of test. Is it necessary? That is, does a religion have to have this feature, otherwise it can't be a religion? And is it sufficient? That is, if something has this feature, does that automatically make it a religion? And see what answer you come up with. the best way to test things is to try and come up with counterexamples. So in other words, if you're testing whether or not a feature is necessary for being a religion, then see if you can come up with an example of a religion that doesn't have that feature. If that's possible, then it proves that that isn't necessary to being religion. So by analogy, you might say that having 4 legs is necessary for being a dog. But actually, if you think about it, it isn't necessary. Because suppose you have a 4-legged dog and then it has an accident and has to have a leg amputated. Does it cease to be a dog? Well, if having 4 legs is necessary to being a dog, it would cease to be a dog. Because if it were necessary, then you can't be a dog without having 4 legs. But clearly you can. You know, it wouldn't cease to be a dog. It would just be a 3-legged dog. And given that a 3-legged dog is possible, then having 4 legs is not necessary for being a dog. Okay, so if belief in a creator God is necessary for being a religion, then there can't be religions that don't involve that. And yet here is this example of Buddhism that the vast majority of people would say it does count as a religion. Now, what you might decide is that actually it's pretty much impossible to come up with a hard and fast definition, which I think is a very interesting conclusion. It means that these sort of bold lines that are drawn in American legal and political thought, are pretty much unsustainable, or you're going to get very odd results. And in the paper topics, I actually asked you to consider some controversial cases. So, for example, Scientology is one. Scientology was, well, I'm going to say started, many people would say invented, by a guy called L. Ron Hubbard in the 20th century. Now, the story goes, L. Ron Hubbard actually was a science fiction writer. He's famous for a series of books, the Battlefield Earth books, which were made into what is widely regarded as the worst movie ever made by John Travolta, a Scientologist. So, you know, L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction author, and the story goes he stood up at a science fiction conference and said, "Anyone can start a religion. Watch me." And shortly thereafter came out with the book Dianetics, which is the basis for Scientology. Now, in America, Scientology classifies as a religion because of a legal battle that they won. In Germany, for example, it does not. It counts as a cult, and it's pretty much illegal in Germany. Now, they've got lawyers working on that, and they're not happy about that. But notice, well, which is it? Is it a religion? If you're in the US, apparently it is. But if you're in Germany, apparently it isn't. What's the difference between a cult and a religion? It can't just be what country you're in. There should be some way of distinguishing, and we want to get at what it is. So, if you want to assess whether or not Scientology is a religion, one way to do it is to see if it meets the criteria that Ninian Smart came up with. Another candidate that I mention is Pastafarianism, or the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. This is a real thing if you haven't heard of it. It's a real thing that was invented by a guy in the aughts. It wasn't the 90s, no, it wasn't that long ago, who was annoyed at the decision of a school board, I think it was in Dover, Pennsylvania, to give equal time to creationism along with teaching evolution. And he was very annoyed at this, and he wrote a satirical letter to them, which got published on the web, saying, well, if you're going to give equal time to creationism, you have to give equal time to my theory of the origin of the universe, which is that the universe was created by a flying spaghetti monster who touched it with his noodly appendage and brought it into being. And, you know, this was obviously satire, this was obviously a joke, but it caught on, and he expanded on it and came up with all, like, there's a big role for pirates in his theory, because he likes pirates, and there's now an International Talk Like a Pirate Day that I think is related to this. And for some reason, this so-called religion is very popular in Scandinavia. He's an American, but it caught on in Scandinavia. And they have huge festivals where they dress like pirates and they hold up pictures of the flying spaghetti monster and stuff like that. And I think I may have mentioned this in the previous video, but a guy, I've forgotten which particular European country it was in, but in your, I did mention it, but I'll tell you again. In your driver's license photo, you're not supposed to wear anything on your head, but they give religious exemptions because some religions, like for example Sikhs, they're not allowed to remove their turbans. Or, for example, in Islam, women are supposed to, or at least some versions of Islam, not all Muslims believe this, but in many versions of Islam, women are supposed to cover their hair when they're out in public. So, they gave religious exemptions. You mustn't wear a hat unless it's for a religious purpose. Well, this guy put a pasta strainer on his head and said, well, I'm a pastafarian. This is religious headwear. And they allowed it. And so his driver's license photo has a picture of him with a pasta strainer, a colander, on his head because it's religious headgear. Should that count? I mean, we know that this was made up as a joke. But suppose, eventually, people forget that it was a joke and believe it in all sincerity. Has it now become a religion? Was it always a religion? Is it never a religion if it was just made up? A similar issue, comes up with Mormonism. Now, Mormonism is largely taken as a respectable religion. I mean, we nearly had a Mormon president with Mitt Romney. But Mormonism is a comparatively recent religion, and there is actually this problem with Mormonism that the founder of Mormonism is widely regarded by non-Mormons as a charlatan. One of the stories foundational to Mormonism is that he was presented with some golden tablets that he was illiterate, Joseph Smith. But he was able to read these golden tablets, which he said were in Reformed Egyptian. Now, Egyptologists say there is no such thing as Reformed Egyptian, but he says there were. And he was able to read them because of some either golden spectacles or some kind of seeing stone that he was given. So he translated these tablets that were presented to him by an angel, and they became the Book of Mormon. Now, Mark Twain has a lot of writings on the Book of Mormon and basically says it's just copied wholesale out of the Bible in big chunks, so he didn't believe in it, and he was more or less a contemporary of Joseph Smith. But also there is the problem that Joseph Smith bought an Egyptian papyrus that was being transported around the US at the time as part of a traveling exhibition. He bought it and claimed to translate it, and claimed it was a long-lost Book of Abraham. Now, at the time he did this, people could not read Egyptian hieroglyphics because they hadn't found they had found the Rosetta Stone. Look up the Rosetta Stone if you've not heard of it. Nowadays it's the name of a language learning system, but it's because of the actual Rosetta Stone is a stone tablet that had the same thing said in different ancient languages on it, and it included Egyptian hieroglyphics, which we didn't know how to translate, and a language which we did know how to translate. So we were able to say, oh, the hieroglyphics mean the same as this, and we know what this means. So it enabled us to translate hieroglyphics, which we weren't able to do before. So at the time Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham, nobody could say, actually, you're saying rubbish, because what this really means is this. But now they can, and it turns out the thing that he translated as the Book of Abraham says no such thing. It's actually just a simple burial document, and it lists the things that are being buried with a particular person. So the suggestion is, well, if that was bogus, well, then the Book of Mormon must be bogus too. Pretty much a problem, you would think, for the status of the Book of Mormon, but doesn't bother most Mormons, and Mormonism is one of the fastest growing religions in the world. So should it worry us that maybe this religion, just like Scientology, was started by someone as kind of a hoax? Should that undermine its status as a religion? Well, if it doesn't, then why not Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? Why shouldn't that count? Okay, so more philosophical this week. Now we're doing what philosophy does, which is asking questions and using philosophical method to challenge claims. That's perhaps the most central skill in philosophy, is asking the right kind of questions, which I think is why it's helpful. A lot of people who get an MA in philosophy then go into the law, because that's a skill that is useful in the law too, being able to ask the right kind of questions. So whereas the first 2 weeks you were just sort of learning stuff, and I mean noticing parallels between the different religions, now I want you to draw on the resources you've acquired from learning all that stuff about the religions and ask some questions about what does this mean about the notion of religion. What kind of things can count as religion? Jediism was another one, by the way. I think when you go into the army, you have to fill out a form, or the armed forces, you have to fill out a form saying what religion you are, and an increasing number of people are putting Jedi, and it's counting because they're big Star Wars fans. So look up Jediism in Wikipedia, and you will find out what I mean, as well as Pastafarianism. So if what we want to do, what we're trying to do, is come up with a definition of religion which works on all the things which we're pretty sure really are legitimate religions, and which doesn't work on things that we want to say, no, those aren't really religion. Turns out to be pretty difficult to do. Maybe you can't do it. That would be an important thing to find out. Then maybe the notion of a religion is kind of bogus. Maybe we shouldn't give religion this special status. That's kind of the philosophical issue for this week. Alright, I've rambled on long enough. This probably means that this video is so long nobody will bother to watch it, but there you go. Talk to you next time.